So welcome to today's life lesson for Foundation English 2. In today's lesson, we're going to look again at poetry. We've been looking at poetry and it's been great. But today I want to look at something slightly different. Yes, we're going to look at a poem, but we are also going to look at an historical journal entry to see how we can compare the two of them. All right, so this is all about analyzing two texts, a journal entry versus a poem. So ultimately we're looking at a similar idea. What the journal entry explores an idea and a poem explores a similar idea, and how these ideas are conveyed in the different genres. Now, when I talk about genres, I'm talking about styles. Okay. So journal entries are a certain genre of writing and poetry is a certain genre of writing. And these two texts you can find in your Stage 9 student book, your Collins Cambridge student book, on around pages 178 to 179. So if you want to annotate, make notes next to the text, next to the poem that we're going to go through as we're going through the live lesson, feel free to grab your student books and do that. So that would be pages 178 to 179. And then whilst I'm here, I'm just going to open up the chat box so I can see your lovely comments as we go on through the lesson. Welcome to those of you who've just joined. Nice to see you. Okay, so analyzing two texts, a journal entry versus a poem. Let's see how they both look at something that is very similar. So in the student book, it says your task is to write 5 paragraphs. So in other words, an analysis. Right? An analysis, getting to the deeper meaning of what's going on. Write 5 paragraphs analyzing the ways in which a non-fiction, so it's real, it's non-fiction, it's real, a non-fiction historical account in a journal and an 18th century poem deal with what? With the experience of a ship's voyage, particularly an Antarctic voyage. Okay. So 18th century, we talk about 18th century, we're actually talking about the 1700s. Okay? So the poem that we're going to look at was written in the 1700s, but the historical account that we are going to look at comes sort of early 1900s, was written around the early 1900s. Okay. So text A, let's have a look at this. And there's a picture of the event that has happened. Here is a ship stranded on ice. Okay. After long months, before I begin, let me make this a bit bigger. After long months of ceaseless, never-ending anxiety and strain, after times when hope beat high and times when the outlook was black indeed, the end of the endurance has come. And because this is in italics, the name, and we're talking about the endurance, and we see a picture of a ship, we know this must be the name of the ship. So the end of the endurance has come. But though we have been compelled to abandon the ship, they can't stay on the ship, which is crushed beyond all hope of ever being righted, ever being fixed, we are alive and well, and we have stores and equipment for the task that lies before us. There's a task that lies before them. The task is to reach land with all the members of the expedition. So now we know this is an expedition that was on a boat, and the boat has become stranded on the ice. It is hard to write what I feel. Remember, this is a journal extract, so the person is being reflective. This is actually Ernest Shackleton, the famous explorer. He is trying to write what he's feeling in his journal to capture everything, but it's hard for him to do so. And why is this so? Well, to a sailor, his ship is more than a floating home. And in the endurance, I had centered ambitions, hopes, and desires. Okay, so in other words, it's almost as if that forward movement of the ship allowed him to realize his ambitions, his hopes, and his desires. Now, straining and groaning, her timbers cracking, because you can imagine the ice squeezing the wood together. So this boat is making a lot of noise. I'm straining and groaning, her timbers cracking, and her wounds gaping. In other words, holes that have been made in the wood through the ice, by the ice, She is slowly giving up her sentient life. Now, something that is sentient has feelings, or can experience things with awareness. So it's almost as if the ship is alive. Okay, she is slowly giving up her sentient life at the very outset of her career. So she had been built for this very expedition, and here she is. She is crushed and abandoned after drifting more than 570 miles in a northwesterly direction during the 281 days since she became locked in the ice. Now, when you include facts like this is typical of journal or diary writing. Facts are included amongst, specifically journal writing, amongst the emotions. Okay, so it's been 281 days since she became locked in the ice. The distance from the point where she became beset to a place where she now rests, so where the ice started collecting, okay, so where she became beset to the place where she now rests, mortally hurt. He still sees her as something that is alive, so it's life-threatening if it's mortally hurt. Mortally hurt in the grip of the floes. Floes are moving blocks of ice. So as you sail towards the Antarctic, more and more ice built up, and over time the ship became stuck and they're getting snowed in. So she's mortally hurt in the grip of the floes. It's 573 miles this distance since this has happened. It's a long time. But the total drift, because they haven't been able to move on a course, they've just been drifting through all observed positions, has been 1,186 miles, and probably we actually covered more than 1,500 miles. So you've given a lot of facts just to put everybody in the know about his expedition. We are now 346 miles from Paulet Island. That's quite a distance. Okay, the nearest point where there is any possibility of finding food and shelter. And if you wanted to work that out in kilometers, I think you double this to convert it to kilometers. So that's probably even further than Durban is from Johannesburg, for example. We are now 346 miles from Paulet Island, the nearest point where there is any possibility of finding food and shelter. So this is their next task that they have to do. A small hut was built there by the Swedish expedition in 1902 and is filled with stores left by the Argentine relief ship. So some Swedish expedition had built a hut in 1902, and luckily an Argentine relief ship, somebody that brings help or aid, has left some food there. Possibly in aid of any further expeditions that were going to take place. So what's nice about the student book is it gives you this vocabulary that you can look up, this glossary that can give you a bit more information as to what's going on in this extract. And the publication of his journal was called The Loss of the Endurance by Ernest Shackleton. All right, so keeping all of that in mind, keeping that image of the boat in mind, this is the early 1900s. Now we go even further back. This poem was written around 1789-ish, which makes it over 200 years old now. How often do you get to read texts that are 200 years old? Now, keep that in mind. We're very lucky to be able to do this. Let's look at the poem, which relates or recounts or a similar experience. And this is just an extract of this very long ballad. This ballad is actually known as the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And it is a ballad. So there is something song-like about it. And in fact, I just want to see if I've got this on my screen here. Sorry, I just see if it'll let me go there. Okay, so this is some background to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And the poem, because we can't look at the whole thing, it's far too long. The poem begins by introducing the ancient mariner, who, with his glittering eye, stops a wedding guest. An ancient mariner is essentially a very old sailor. Okay, he stops a wedding guest. They're at a wedding, from attending a nearby wedding celebration. And why is this? Well, the mariner stops the young man to tell him the story of a ship, providing no introduction, but simply beginning his tale. So there'll be an introduction to the poem where the mariner stops this man, and then he just starts telling his tale. Despite the wedding guest's efforts to leave, the mariner continues to speak. So it's a bit ominous, okay? The mariner's story begins with the ship leaving harbor, and sailing southward. A tremendous storm then blows the ship even further to the South Pole, where the crew are awed as they encounter mist, snow, cold, and giant glaciers. An albatross breaks the pristine lifelessness of the Antarctic. The sailors greet it as a good omen, and a new wind rises up, propelling the ship. Day after day, the albatross appearing in the morning when the sailors call for it, and soaring behind the ship. But then, as the other sailors cry out in dismay, the mariner, for reasons unexplained, shoots and kills the albatross with his crossbow. And so, so the poem continues. It's a very, very long poem. But like I said, it's a ballad. And if we can come back to this main document. All right, so now let's look at this extract from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his overtaking wings and chased us south along. So there's this big wind blowing their ship along. Next up a bit. With sloping masts and dipping prow, the front end of the ship, the prow is dipping, okay, they're all at a slope here in this wind. As who pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe. It's almost as if the wind is seeing the ship as his enemy, and forward bends his head, and the ship drove fast. Loud roared the blast, and southward, aye, we fled. So they are trying to escape this wind. Okay. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. Difficult to believe. It's wondrous. It's so cold. And ice, mast high, so right above them, came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs, did send a dismal sheen, a gloomy smoothness. Nor shapes of men, nor beasts we ken, we know. The ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled, like noises in a swoon. Now, swooned is an archaic version of the word to swoon, and it sounds like the word wound, not around. You'd expect it to sound like around, but it doesn't. So it's what we call an I rhyme. An I rhyme, because it looks like it's going to rhyme, but guess what? It doesn't. Around and swooned. This idea of the act of fainting, but especially from strong emotion. If you swoon, it's from strong emotion. And so this ice that is making a noise as it takes hold of the ship, causes all these sounds to be made, this cracking, this growling, this roaring, this howling. Okay. It's quite emotional images that are conjured up there. So this idea of a ship being caught in a storm and then being sent into the ice, into the icy waters, and being trapped is quite different, don't you think? It's quite different, don't you think, than the actual extract. So my main point that I'm trying to make, and I'll try and speak a bit louder, is that this poem is a very different experience to a similar situation that is recounted in this journal, isn't it? So if you were going to do an analysis, if you were going to analyze these two texts, this journal text, and look at what had gone on, it would probably be, I'm glad you can hear me now, it would probably be a very, very different, it's a different experience to what's being described in the poem, isn't it? And it's almost as if the poem has a bit more impact because it's as though it draws us into the moment. Okay. Right, so let's have a look at how you would go about analyzing the two different poems. And what I would suggest is that if you have an extract, you have the first text, text A, look at text A before you even consider looking at text B, because it's too difficult to keep both texts in your mind at the same time as trying to figure out the focus of the story. So I think look at endurance, look at these ideas that it wants you to explore, and this comes from the teacher's resource for this particular chapter. And they've given a lovely table that gives you the answers to the table in your student book. So we can explore some of these. As I was saying, focus on the one text first. So if we look at the text of the endurance text, the focus of the story is a narrator describes how the ship is stuck in ice and what they have to do next. They have to find land. Okay, so that's the focus of the story. Now, what form does it take? Well, it takes the form of a diary or a journal. We read as if experiencing the events at the same time as the writer. The writer talks us through what has happened and what is happening now and what they have to do. So in a way, we also experience that along with the writer. Now, what about the feature of the use of lines and sentences? Well, in this section, in this text, long, complex sentence to begin with a dramatic final clause. So the sentence opens up, the beginning sentence, and it ends in a dramatic way. And this is just simply the beginning of the journal entry. Let's have a look. After long months of ceaseless anxiety and strain, after times when hope beat high and times when the outlook was black indeed, the end of the endurance has come. Look, this is a very long sentence, 3 lines worth. And the closing clause, the final clause, is where the drama comes in. The end of the endurance has come. So that is how he evokes the emotion in his journal entry, and he's going to go on to explain what has happened. There are shorter sentences later on. Shorter sentences later on create sudden emotive pause. It is hard to write what I feel. So let's have a look at that emotive pause, that idea of giving some emotional pause to something. Where was that? Oh yes, it was actually quite near the end. Look at all these long sentences. The endurance had come, but though we have been compelled to abandon ship, etc., etc., we have stores and equipment, and there's a task, and the task is to reach land with all the members of the expedition. So he's gone into the factual side of things, sort of. Okay, there's a bit of emotion, abandoning, crushed, everything like that. But it is hard to write what I feel. Now he must focus on the now. How is he feeling now? And then he explains why it's so hard, because it wasn't just a ship or a home to him. It was more than that. It was about realizing his hopes and his ambitions. All right, so let's come back down to the table. So that is how lines and sentences have been used as a feature in the journal article. They've been used to evoke emotion and to inform. And then what about tenses? What tense is it written in, and why is that even relevant? Well, it is mostly in the present tense, and you'll find that in journal entries, it's very much how you feel at the moment when you're writing the diary. Even if you're writing about events that have happened to you in the day, you're writing now, you're reflecting on those events now, and that's why it's generally written in the present tense. And it's describing Shackleton's current feelings, but does look back to previous events. I had centered ambitions, for example, but it only does this to say how that contrasts then his ambitions, his hope, his desires with his sort of hopelessness now, how that contrast, that reality then with the contrast now. And so that's how the use of the present tense is effective in the journal entry. Now, let's go on to the next 3 features. Now, what about vocabulary? Well, there are emotional nouns. An emotional noun, what's that? Well, anxiety, to do with emotions, and it's a thing, it's a noun. Strain, same thing, it's a thing, it's a noun. Your hopes, your desires, okay, so there are emotional nouns and noun phrases. So anything that's more than a word, it's a phrase. So ceaseless anxiety and strain is a phrase. Ceaseless anxiety and strain, that is a noun frame. A noun phrase, sorry. Okay. And what do these do? How do they function? Well, they describe how the narrator and the crew feel. They are feeling quite hopeless, quite devastated. There's also present participles of verbs. So if you see this ing form of the verb, it's in the present. Right now, they are straining, or the ship is straining. Right now, the ship is groaning, or the men are moaning, or whatever it might be. So it's ing. And this adds to the visual, what we see, and the oral, what we hear, the visual and oral picture of the ship and its ongoing situation. And that's why the ing form is used, because the situation is ongoing. Right now it's groaning, it's still going to be doing that for a while. And that brings us into that present. It helps us immerse more in the present. Okay. Language. Imagery, simile, metaphor, personification. Well, the ship is personified through the use of she, this idea of wounds. She has wounds, gaping holes, but she's mortally hurt. And that it's almost as if she's an injured or dying creature, and that's how he personifies her. And why do that? Because it shows you how connected he is to the boat. He sees the boat as a living entity. That's how much it means to him. The boat is his means to realizing his ambition. Other stylistic features, well, there's the use of factual and geographical information, which we would expect from an explorer, an expedition and an explorer. Now, if we look at the poem in contrast, this poem where there's a storm blast and the wings of the storm taking them over and blowing them away, and the ship trying to escape and run away from the storm, and the mist and the snow that grows, and this ice that comes floating past that's really high, and the cliffs in the distance that are just like a sheen that can't quite reach the safety of land there, and what the ice starts doing to the ship, essentially, and the noises it makes. Well, so how does this differ? The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, well, the narrator, or the speaker in the poem, the speaker, tells how, as the boat fled south, trying to escape that storm, they met snow and ice and were slowly surrounded by it. So that is the story or the focus. Okay, what about the form? Well, it takes the form of a poem, mainly written in verses or stanzas of 4 lines. Okay. So if we have a close look at that, we've got the verses or the stanzas, stanza 1, stanza 2, verse 1, verse 2, and then mostly of 4 lines, most of them. Okay. So there'll be a time when there aren't, and there's a reason for that. There's an explanation of ideas or a fuller description that's given, but mostly it's 4 lines per verse. Now, what about the use of lines and sentences? How does the poet do that? Well, the lines are generally similar in length, except for the last in each stanza, the last one in each verse, which tends to be shorter. Why is that so? Well, because it acts as a 3rd footstep in the rhythm. So it affects the rhythm, and that creates that ballad-like or song-like feature or characteristic of the poem. That's why some lines are longer and some are shorter. It's to do with creating a rhythm. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his o'ertaking wings and chased us south along. Let's look at these last 2 lines. The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward we fled. So there's a certain rhythm, and it's that song-like rhythm. Okay. Which is very different to the extract. There was nothing sing-songy about the extract. Very, very different. Now, language or tenses. Now, the tale is recounted in the past tense, because remember, we said this was a mariner, an old sailor, an ancient mariner, who stopped a wedding guest from going into a wedding because he had to tell him this tale, a tale of something he'd experienced. And that is why it is recounted in the past tense. This is what happened then. But the drama of the events makes it feel like the reader is experiencing it now. So that's quite interesting, that the poem can do, in a way, what the journal is doing, that experience. So let's have a look here at the last 3 stanzas. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice, mast high as the mast of the ship, came floating by, as green as emeralds. Obviously had some kind of sort of botanical something included in it. Not grass. I'm looking for something more biological. Maybe some of you can suggest it on the chat. But that makes ice go green. What is it that I'm looking for? Anyway, we don't have time because I'm running out of time. And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor least we can. We know the ice was all between us all. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swoon. Okay, so he has used the past tense, but the way that he evokes those images is like we are put into that situation now. It's very interesting how the past can bring you into the now. Now, language vocabulary. There's repetition. Well, that's we would expect from a ballad, from a song, right? Repetition gives dramatic effect. It builds tension. Ice was here and ice was there. And in that third verse, ice is repeated that to emphasize the idea of ice being around everywhere. Also, clear, simple noun phrases create picture of ship and snow. So things like sloping mast, dipping prow, dismal sheen. There's also lots of active verbs such as chase, pursued, bend, which give a sense of race and drama. They have to outrace this wind that's blowing them. Okay. Now, what about things like imagery, simile, and personification, etc.? Well, the storm blast is personified as a cruel tyrant who is earnest and with wings like a god or mythical beast. And later, the ice is personified in the way it growls and howls. And then there's other stylistic features like the second and fourth lines of each verse. They rhyme. So every second and fourth line will rhyme. Now, we've come to the end of our session, but the whole point of this exercise was to show you how you have to look very, very closely at language, whether it's in an extract or in a poem. You're doing the same thing. You are looking at language and the effects it creates and how it provokes thought.